So in this step 4-3, the goal will be to inject the conversion ratio into the pipe so that the pipe itself doesn't know which ratio it's going to be used with. If I were to go back a little bit in time, specifically to regenerate a test pipe in order to thoroughly review its intricate structure, you would observe that we had previously and intentionally removed this particular component from it. This notation here isn't really of interest to us. We're simply going to think of it like this. Or even as a number, this will always mean the value coming from the left, and since it was generated, it will always be of type number. What goes out to the right will be of type number, and will pass a number as a parameter, since that will be the conversion ratio. With this, try to update and apply it to your pipe. Normally, the modification shouldn't be too complicated. I'll let you do it. So let's look at the solution code for this step 4.3. We can start with the pipe. The modification wasn't particularly complicated since previously the conversion ratio was hard-coded directly into the pipe. Now that our conversion ratio comes from a function parameter, the change was pretty straightforward. However, using this parameter is a bit more complicated. You kind of have to know about it. Pipe parameters are passed using colons. That means here, with a colon, I give it 80,000, which was my previous ratio that was internal to the pipe. Now, I move it up into the component. If I have several parameters, I can change the colons. For example, I could have this. I can do this. Here, it doesn't make sense in my pipe since it doesn't interpret them, but we could have had a second param and a third param, let's say, as strings. This allows us to add a lot of information, a lot of customization to a pipe. Depending on the situation, we might need it. That's also precisely why we can subtly tweak this, this visual display a little bit with this. Oops, I meant the other way around. That was more or less what was generated by default by Angular. What this actually means is that we are going to have a series of parameters. So it uses the spread operator in this way. We have an array that will be passed up, and so we'll have a sequence of parameters. The difficulty with this kind of notation is that it forces us to specify a type for each of the parameters passed. Depending on the situation, either we can stick with what's generated by default, but we obviously remove unknown and replace it with string, number, etc. Or, quite simply, we cast it as we did before and use a number parameter. And then after that, we can add param2 and so on, as I showed. At least this way, we have fine control over each param, over the type of each param. And to show it again, well, I'm going to do convertBalance. OK. And to show it again, either that's for multiple parameters, but for us, it will be considered like this. In the output, we have 1.2 bitcoins, which is equivalent to $96,000. For now, this output doesn't change. However, what's important to note is that the conversion ratio has been lifted up into the component. Actually, that's what we like. Each time, it's about lifting all this data up as much as possible, even up to the backend. And finally, our front-end application, in the end, everything is connected all the way to the backend. That's what we're aiming for in the long run. What's also important to know here is that for the same amount, the same object, the same number which is still the 1.2 for my code, I can also interpret it and now apply another conversion ratio to it, for example, to get its equivalent in Ethereum by applying a second ratio. That's what's interesting. We have a single variable that can be interpreted differently to be displayed in another way. But our starting data always remains the same. So to wrap up this step 4, which actually included 3 sub-steps on pipes, which are really a very, very important software block in Angular to understand. We've used several of the native ones. Angular has even more. Number to display thousands, separators, and decimals. Date to format dates. JSON to display the entirety of a JSON object. Currency to add currency symbols. convertBalance, which is the one we created to apply a conversion ratio to an amount. And finally, we added a rate, which for now is static in the component, but which we could later link to an API. So we could query a remote API and regularly, or based on certain actions, retrieve the Bitcoin conversion rate. This allows us to have a front-end display that is always in sync with this conversion ratio, which is always connected to the backend data. That's how we're going to seriously move forward step by step. So that's it for step 4, which was the first introduction to the Angular pipe.